Welcome, everybody. It's very nice to see you all here. I'm very pleased today to have one of the first of our Leaders Forum speakers, Tim Rubb. Tim is a former student. He was an excellent student. I like to think sometimes when I introduce these people that someone came and he had no idea what he wanted to do, and we opened his eyes to a whole new sphere, but I'm afraid that's absolutely not at all true from Tim's point of view. Tim came to us from Middlebury, where he had a degree in art history. I think he pretty much knew that he wanted to run museums, although he'll tell us whether or not that's true. But certainly while here, he did a lot of work in the nonprofit area, both in our curriculum and at the rest of Yale. And I would say, for me at least, as I look at Tim, has a little more of the, I know what I want to do, and I can figure out what here I can use to help me get to where I want to be. He's had a very interesting career in museums. I was just, we were speaking in my office, and it seemed a little more peripatetic than some other museum directors that I've known, and maybe in the questioning that may come up. He went from here to Dartmouth and worked at the Hood. Then he went, let me see if I get it in order, he went to Cincinnati, and then Cleveland, and now a year or so ago to Philadelphia, all at the levels of running the place. In his earlier life, he had done curatorial work as well, so he comes to museum directorship both from knowing something about art and knowing something about business, which I would say is probably a requisite for running a museum as well. I'm very fond of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, not just because it's a great art museum, but because it's been the home of some of our alums for many years. Gail Harrity, who's the COO at Philadelphia and part of the board, has been at Philadelphia for years. And last year, Eliza Johnson went and joined them. Some of you in the second year know Eliza from last year. A few years before that, Zoe Carr went there as well. So they've been very warm and opening to our interns, and I hope they'll continue to do that under the new boss. So it's a great pleasure for me to ask you to help me, join me in welcoming Tim as he comes and talks to us about museum management. So Tim Rubb, please.
Thank you. Over here. Thank you, Sharon. That was a largely accurate introduction. I do want to make one correction, and that is that I was an okay student. I had some challenges, most notably in the economics course that she taught.
It's a challenge for them all.
It should be subtitled, I think, in the course guide, "I take no prisoners," which is a good thing in an introduction to economics. I had a wonderful, wonderful time here, and I am, of course, delighted to be back here in New Haven and to be back among students at the School of Management. I came here 25 years ago, in 1985, after finishing my graduate education in art history and having worked for several years as a curator. And I came with a specific idea. And much to my surprise, I have pursued that idea in a rather single-minded way ever since. Now, the simple and simplistic way of describing that idea is that I thought I would like to become the director of an art museum. And more accurately, I would say that my interest then, as it is now, was in making museums function more effectively and strengthening their capacity for change. And that I should say was based on my experience of having worked at the Cooper Hewitt Museum for a number of years as a curator and having seen museums function up close and having wondered from the day I walked in how in God's name they ever got anything done. They are wonderful and complex and interesting places. And in some would say they have long been places that were resistant to change and to any kind of managerial input. So I would say that my focus at that time was largely on management. And so I came here with a hope, and it was really no more than that at the time, that an education of the type that SOM offered might be useful to me. I should also say that I had, coming into SOM and also going out after 2 years and back into the field of art history and museums, I had no illusions about a management education from here or anywhere else being appreciated in the museum field. Indeed, the director of the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York, where I worked at the time, told me bluntly when I sat down with her and said I wanted to go to SOM, really I planned to, she told me that it would be a waste of my time. And in 1987, when I graduated from SOM, there were only a handful of people in the field, that is the field of museum leadership, Tom Krenz perhaps being the most notable. Some of you may know him as another graduate of SOM, who had a degree from a business school of any sort. And it would be another 20 years after 1987 before I heard a trustee say publicly that the training I had received at Yale would be an asset to the institution I had been asked to lead. It's a fact. Now, whether or not that training has proven valuable at the several institutions where I have served as director during the past 2 decades, at Dartmouth College, as Sharon mentioned, and then at the public museums in Cincinnati, Cleveland, and now in Philadelphia, I should let others decide. What I can say, and say categorically, is it has been enormously useful to me. Now in my field, again, in the world of the art museum, it is still customary to define the success of a director and his or her leadership of the museum by fairly traditional measures. That is to say, by how well we manage operating budgets. And I'm proud to say that in 20 years of being a director, I've always come to the end of the year with a balanced budget. I'm also sad to say that because there's nothing more I'd like to do than spend more money than I brought in. But it's not a way to keep a job or to keep your trustees happy. We also are measured, as we should be, by the development of a collection through the acquisition of important works of art. So I want to stress here, and I'll just spend a few minutes talking about this, that directors of art museums, first and foremost, deal with the content side, with the collection, with programs, with exhibitions, with education, the very things that people come to museums to enjoy and to learn from. And so I'll just give you a quick whistle-stop tour of some of the things that I'm proud having acquired for the various collections that I've been the steward of over the past 20 years. One of Picasso's greatest etchings from 1930, Head of a Woman, one of Rembrandt's greatest prints, the so-called Ecce Homo from 1652, 2 prints that I acquired when I was director of the museum at Dartmouth College. And then moving on, some acquisitions at the Cincinnati Art Museum, this great image of the Yosemite Valley, done by the American Hudson River School painter Albert Bierstadt, the early 1870s, on one of the various trips that he made to the West. A remarkable picture, as fresh as the day it was painted. Or this wonderful picture from a decade later, rather bleached out on this, in this reproduction, I'm sorry to say, this landscape by Pierre-Auguste Renoir of the Isle of Guernsey, done in 1883 during a summer sojourn there. And to bring the story up to, reasonably up to date, this great Indian statue, a temple statue of Shiva, dating from the 10th century, from a temple in South India that we acquired for the Cleveland Museum of Art at auction for a world record price just about 2 years ago. This deaccessioned by another museum in this country, the Albright Knox in Buffalo. And then in Cleveland, most recently, our major acquisition of the past year, this spectacular man and horse armor. Horse armors being actually far rarer than armors for men, dating from the first decade of the 16th century that we acquired from a Swiss private collection for the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The 7th object of its type in this country to enter a public collection, the first one in 50 years. We're also judged by how we care for our collections. So a lot of my work has been spent obviously on the storage and management of very large collections. Philadelphia has just, by way of example, 240,000 works of art in its holdings, and therefore the management and record keeping associated with that kind of work is truly significant and very, very important. We also have to take care of things, sometimes things that have been treated very poorly in the past. Here I show you the process of reinstalling a 30-foot mural that was painted by the great Spanish surrealist painter Joan Miró in Cincinnati in 1947, a remarkable thing that had spent the first 40 years of its life in a restaurant on the 10th floor of a hotel and was covered with grime when we received it. So it had been recently cleaned and put back onto its stretcher and placed back on the wall during my tenure there, and I counted that a very, very important step forward for the care of the collection. And here to just cite another example, we've just finished the conservation of this great painting in Philadelphia, the so-called Gross Clinic by the great 19th century American painter Thomas Eakins, a picture that had been significantly altered in the early 20th century. And we began to study when we acquired it with the Pennsylvania Academy of the Arts in about 4 years ago for the whopping price of $68 million. This in order to keep a great Philadelphia icon, Eakins being a Philadelphia painter, and this picture having been contracted to be purchased by Alice Walton for her new museum in Crystal Springs in Bentonville, Arkansas, and Philadelphia rallied together and raised $68 million to keep this great piece of cultural patrimony, if you wish to call it that, home. And so we just conserved that. I encourage you, anyone coming to Philadelphia, to come see it. It will be up at the museum until the end of this year, and the restoration work we've done on this painting is nothing short of remarkable, if I do say so myself. And of course, we're judged by our exhibitions. Here's an installation shot of a show we did on the city of Barcelona in the 19th century. So works by the great Catalan architect Antonio Gaudí. This in Cleveland. We're judged by how we represent our collections. Here, a reinstallation shot of the great galleries of American art in the Cincinnati Art Museum, which were fully reinstalled and reorganized and reinterpreted during my tenure. And we're judged by the many tens of millions of dollars we raise for acquisitions, for the conservation of works of art, and for the renovation of our large and expensive buildings. And here I'll just show you a few of the things I've done in the past decade or so. This is a renovation, or this was a renovation of the Cincinnati Art Museum that encompassed about 15,000 square feet and allowed us to reinstall a major part of the collection and took 4 years to complete. Oops. And then to move on, you'll see a pattern forming here. This is the work we began to do in Cleveland, to take an old physical plant, the original building of 1916, and several later buildings, removing some of them and reforming the entire facility to make it ready for its second century. And here's the project as it was proposed and built during my tenure, at least largely built. The original building there, new wings here, a renovation of these spaces, and a great atrium space in the middle, substantially recasting the building, both in terms of renovating old parts of the facility. This is the old garden court, and here's what it became. And then here's a view of the atrium that we're building to knit the whole complex together. And here's that atrium in the process of being built right now. And lastly, since I can't seem to escape these kinds of projects, having just come to Philadelphia, I've also inherited an enormous project to renovate and expand our 600,000 square foot main building from 1916, opened in 1928 actually, and much in need of renovation and improvement. And here's a picture of that building as it exists today. So I invite you to come down and see that work. And finally, we're judged by the work we do to engage new audiences and connect with our own communities. Here's a view of the detail of the front door at the Cleveland Museum of Art. The work we do with exhibitions and programs to bring young audiences in, to renew our visitorship. And lastly, how we reach out to the community. This is a great annual parade held on the circle outside of the Cleveland Museum of Art on the second Saturday of every June, which is a remarkable festival of the arts and a remarkable convening of the community, and the museum is at the heart of that work. Now, it is far more difficult to come back to the matter at hand, yet nonetheless vitally important to evaluate the success of museum directors by another set of measures that are, in my opinion, just as valuable, and perhaps even more so, for understanding and appreciating the effectiveness of the institution they are responsible for managing. A short but by no means exhaustive list of these measures might include improvements in governance, such as the development of a museum's board of trustees. Easier said than done, I should add parenthetically. Or it might include building stronger relationships with various external constituencies, something that is not done very well by most art museums. Or it might be about fostering a disciplined and consistent approach to institutional planning. These and many others I could mention are, of course, familiar to all of you here. They are also some of the tools that my education at SOM equipped me to understand and use. I've also found these tools to be enormously helpful, perhaps more so than my art historical training or my curatorial experience, for the task of dealing with a complex job that I have had and I have today in both small and large organizations. So the first thing I'd like to say, now that I'm back here after such a long time, is thank you to SOM. The decision I made to come here in 1985 was one of the most unusual choices I've ever made in my life. It baffled virtually everyone I knew. I've been trained as an art historian, as a curator. I had a job in a museum. Why would you want to do anything else? And that everyone included both my parents and my wife, I should add. But it was also, in retrospect, one of the most valuable decisions I've ever made, and I hope you too will conclude that 25 years from now as well. Now, Philadelphia is the fourth, as you've heard, the fourth institution in which I've served as director over the past 20 years. During that time, I've had the pleasure and the challenge of working at ever larger and more complex institutions. The Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College had 25 employees and an operating budget of $2.5 million. And I've always felt that was just about right. The Philadelphia Museum of Art, by contrast, has 500 employees and a budget of over $50 million. And I will tell you, it's a handful to manage every day. Now, although the challenge of scaling up in terms of size and complexity was just that, a challenge, as well as very interesting, what's most striking to me in retrospect is that I entered this field, that is the field of managing art museums, at the beginning of a period of enormous change in that field. Over the past 2 decades, many of the changes we have witnessed, although certainly not all have been positive ones, I'm pleased to say, at least from my perspective. And I'd just like to share some of those changes with you. Among the most significant, in my opinion, have been, first of all, the rapid growth and diversification of the nonprofit sector over the last generation. And this includes, but obviously is not limited to, arts institutions of all types across the spectrum, from very small to very large. Today, the field is much larger and much more crowded than it was when I entered the art museum community in the early 80s and when I became a director in 1991. Secondly, there's been a remarkable change in arts audiences, a change really marked by one fact, that is, there's been a phenomenal growth in arts audiences over the last generation or so, and this is a trend that has only recently begun to level off. And I should also say this has been accompanied by the increasing democratization of access to the arts. There's a lot to be done, a lot more to be done in terms of diversifying audiences. But if you take a snapshot of today and compare it to a snapshot of who was going to museums or symphonies or dance performances 25 years ago, there's a really marked change that has occurred. And I think that obviously will continue in the future. And lastly, and more recently, there has been, and I'm very glad for this, a growing appreciation in recent years of the role that cultural institutions can play in the revitalization of the life of our cities. And so that means that the conversation that I have as the director of a civic museum with politicians, with donors, with the leaders of other cultural institutions is much richer and more interesting and more engaged with the public sector and this public realm than it ever has been before. And I count that to be a very, very good thing indeed. And lastly, we have developed, or there has been developed by the public over the last generation, far broader expectations of art museums in terms of what they do and whom they serve. In other words, we have many more people knocking on our doors asking us to do many more things than we did in the past. And that, by and large, I think is a very, very good thing. But as you can well imagine, it has complicated the lives of museums incredibly and made it a challenge to manage all these demands because they are far greater than they were before. Now, against these changes, again, largely positive, I should also note that there have been other developments, again, in the last generation that represent significant challenges for institutions like the one I now lead. And I'll just mention a few. Amongst the most important of these have been, and I put this one right at the top, since I've led public museums for the last decade, and I will finish my career most assuredly at a public museum, and that is the continued erosion of public trust in civic institutions. Secondly, and a close second in my opinion, and this is particularly an issue that affects the way we think about our publics and our work in a civic art museum, and that is that there has been a widespread and continuing decline in the public school systems of our large cities, which has meant that one of our traditionally most steadfast and reliable partners in bringing young people to the museum, 20 years ago, every fourth grader in the Philadelphia school system made a visit to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. That's no longer the case, and I can't tell you if or when that will ever occur again. So one of our most steadfast and reliable partners to continue with this thought in bringing young people to the museum is no longer either steadfast or reliable. And that's a problem because institutions like ours need strong partners to work with. Thirdly, this is a real challenge on the financial and operational side. There has been a dramatic change over the last generation in the cost of acquiring and maintaining those assets that are central to the work of a museum. That is to say, purchasing or even borrowing works of art. It's much more expensive to do it. It's much more challenging to build and to continue to develop a collection. And if we can't do that well, then we are in trouble. There's no doubt about that. And along with that, it has become increasingly costly, to refer back to the slides I just showed you, to create and maintain aesthetically significant facilities that these institutions require. All of this done without a correspondingly dramatic increase in the growth of revenues. Our revenues are not growing. In fact, they've been declining over the last several years. But ironically, works of art are no less expensive than they were a few years ago. In fact, they're even more expensive. And the per square foot cost of building new facilities or renovating them continues to rise as well. So we are, in fact, at this moment caught in a bind, and a very uncomfortable one at that. And finally, I would point to, as a troubling change in recent years, the concentration of resources and authority in an ever smaller number of museums in places like New York, Washington, and looking to the future, Los Angeles. And I recall taking a course at SOM many years ago when we looked at monopolies and oligopolies, yes? Concentration of power in a few small organizations. That process, I would argue, and I don't think anyone would disagree with me in this room, is not limited to the for-profit sector. There are similar forces at work in the cultural world, and they will, I think, have some regrettable and perhaps difficult to anticipate consequences in the future, particularly for cities like Philadelphia or Chicago or Kansas City, Toledo and the like, Detroit certainly, that have had great art museums and have great collections as well. Now, there is yet another set of issues that museums face today that some of my colleagues might characterize as challenges. And indeed, in a sense, they are, but many others, and I would count myself among them, see them rather as opportunities. And I'll just, again, mention a few. First and foremost, there is the question of how we are going to prepare ourselves to deal with the remarkable demographic changes that will continue to reshape this country's urban populations and eventually fundamentally alter the composition of the museum's attendance and membership base. This is a complicated issue. It's going to require fundamental change on the part of art museums in terms of what they present and how they interact with new audiences. We are reluctant, I will say, as a profession, to attend to those signals clearly. They are out there. It's the train that's coming down the track. You can see it from a mile away. And what's surprising to me is how slow museums are in responding to these demographic changes, because they will most assuredly be at our front door in the not too distant future. Secondly, we need to understand and address in a thoughtful and creative way the remarkable transformation of media that we are now witnessing in the visual arts, and the emergence, and I should also add the enthusiastic embrace by a younger generation, of a wide array of art-making activities that are very, very different from the kind of art that we have collected in the past, and the kind of art that has been made up till the present and will continue to be made. But these do not favor new media, video, collaborative art-making activities, digital media, and the like. These do not favor the collecting and presenting habits of traditional institutions like mine. We are at a moment, and I don't think this is hyperbole at all, we are at a moment in terms of the making of visual images and their use by artists that is as significant, or perhaps even more so, than the early Renaissance, when the introduction of one-point perspective and new painting and printing technologies fundamentally changed the way that art was made and the relationship of the artist to the world. Equally strong forces are at work today. Museums, while they collect things and cherish things and safeguard things from the past, also have to be thinking about the present and looking to the future. And if we don't do that, I have a sneaking suspicion that you or your children will come into the museum perhaps never having seen an oil painting or print or traditional sculpture on the walls of the homes of your family or your relatives, and you'll say, what is that? So understanding what art is about in a changing world, in a world where technology is changing that conversation, is a really interesting place to be. It can be scary sometimes, but it's also remarkably energizing as well. And on a related note, I think it's also essential for us being art museums, to understand and act quickly upon the ways in which digitization will reshape how we present our collections, share information, and communicate with our audiences. Now, this is second nature to all of you. I understand that. It is not second nature necessarily to a board of trustees whose average age is 68. It is not second nature to a generation of curators who have grown up with analog records, and many of them without having learned computer skills only late in their careers. It's also a challenge, and a very, very significant one in terms of taking analog records, in our case, records for 240,000 works of art, basic data about the object, curatorial information, conservation records, old black and white photographs, and translating them all into digital form. The transition that we're undergoing right now has taken a long time already. It will continue to take a long time. But it is absolutely important because it's going to open up new doors for us and change our relationship with the world beyond the walls of the museum. And I, for one, can't wait for that to happen. I think it is going to be a wonderful thing indeed. Now, let me say that all of the issues that I've identified thus far are very important. And obviously, they occupy a great deal of my time at work today. But what I find most intriguing and challenging as a director is a dilemma that has actually been with us for a very long time. And I do want to share this question with you because I think it's really at the heart of my work and the work that museums do. Quite often, institutions, how many of you have been to the Philadelphia Museum of Art? Excellent. So you know it's a big old house full of interesting stuff. Quite often, and it's also an old museum, it's the second, historically speaking, it's the second oldest major art museum in the United States. The Met is older. Philadelphia's was founded in 1876 on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the United States, when a great centennial exposition was held in Philadelphia in Fairmount Park, and the main exposition building in that great fair was devoted to the museum. It became the museum's first home. So we've been around for a long time. We are indeed venerable. So quite often institutions like the Philadelphia Museum of Art are described, and I think quite rightly, as conservators of tradition, and therefore, perhaps unfairly, perceived as places that are not open to innovation and change. You've never had that feeling when you walk into an old art museum like the Philadelphia Museum of Art, have you? No. Indeed, if the mission of an institution like ours is to collect and preserve the very best of the past and to encourage an appreciation of these achievements in a new generation, then the challenge of dealing with these perceptions of conservatism, of stodginess, of resistance to innovation certainly comes with the territory. And that's okay. But I think the truth of the matter is more complex than that. Again, it really lies at the heart of what we do, and I think it has to animate the way we think about the future and think strategically about the choices that we as a museum make. Now, there are many points that one might make about our great civic art museums, and I do count Philadelphia as one of them. One is that they were founded for educational reasons, to provide access to important examples of the fine and decorative arts, to improve, very 19th century notion, to improve the quality of American manufactured goods and to make them more economically competitive in the marketplace. Another motive was social. Again, we're talking about the founding of these institutions more than a century ago. To elevate public taste and, in a truly democratic way, provide every citizen with access to the great artistic achievements, past and present, of humankind. Now, in both cases, it's important to note that providing information about and access to the art of the past was not an antiquarian goal. It was not simply because these things were old and good, but rather the motive had a present purpose. A knowledge and appreciation of the history of the arts was not simply considered a good in and of itself. It was, more importantly, understood and appreciated as a foundation stone, and indeed a catalyst for innovation and creativity. Now, it is even today difficult for those of us who work in great encyclopedic art museums to strike and maintain a fine balance between being conservators of the great and noble artistic traditions of the past on the one hand, and using the museum as an instrument for fostering innovation and creativity on the other. But we must, because the art museum is one of the few places in our society, the library being the other one, in which we can bring the past into fruitful conversation with the present, and in so doing, help each and every one of us imagine a new and sometimes very different future. This process, which is unpredictable and quite often magical in my opinion, is of course implied in the very word museum. A place of the muses, a place of inspiration, and a place, in other words, to imagine. And it is, I should add here, a curious but inescapable fact that knowledge of the past, of intellectual and artistic traditions, of what has come before us, is an essential ingredient of innovation and creativity. That's the hardest thing. That's at the heart of what we do, but it's also the hardest thing to activate, to animate, to bring right to the center of the experience of the museum, but it has to be. We have to continue to find ways of doing it. Otherwise, we will not be true to our missions. Now, lastly, I'd like to offer a few observations about what I've learned about nonprofit management over the years and how this, at least some of it, I think, relates to my experiences here at SOM. First of all, I often characterize my work as a director as having to do largely with constituent management. I was at Harvard some years ago attending a session for art museum directors, and we had a guest who was a lecturer not only in the Harvard Business School, but also in the Kennedy School of Management and the law school, look at this group of museum directors and say, I feel sorry for you. You have so many groups to report to. How can you ever figure out how to do your work? And indeed, that's the case. We deal day in, day out with groups both within and outside the museum, and we have to orchestrate those relationships and do so effectively. It's interesting, but it's not always easy, and it certainly is complicated. It also makes me grateful both that SOM insisted that its students think about organizational dynamics, and I assume you have been asked to do so as students here. And also makes me grateful that I took Doug Ray's course in political analysis for managers many, many years ago, and I continue to find that useful today. Secondly, I'd like to make the observation that typically we speak about leadership and management as two separate and largely different issues. Now, leadership, in my opinion, unfairly, most often occupies the spotlight, while thoughtful management is rarely given, again, in my opinion, all the attention it deserves. Yet if I could wave a wand and change one thing, it would be to make improvements in the way that museums are managed in all of the areas that are familiar to you: budgeting, planning, communications, defining priorities, and problem solving. And if we could do that and do that well and manage these institutions much more crisply, much more effectively, much more purposefully, we would make tremendous progress. And I think that would be truly a worthwhile thing. Now, as a manager, I have found that paying attention to these matters, again, managerial matters, is both richly rewarding in terms of helping to clarify our mission and also helping people understand how we can best fulfill it. And I think this is also one of the keys to building institutional capacity. It's also helped me to drive decision-making as far into the institution as I possibly can in order to build a shared sense of responsibility for how the institution is managed and how it needs to change. And I've had, let me say parenthetically, I've had the good fortune, I would even say the privilege, of managing museums and leading them as their director at a time when the leadership model in museums has really changed quite significantly. It would be fair to say that a generation or two ago, the director could say, do this, and people would indeed do that. And when I arrived in Cincinnati and then in Cleveland, I had similar kinds of conversations. I walked in and asked, how do you do this here? And they said, you tell us how you want it done, and we will do it. And my answer, which baffled my staff initially, both in Cincinnati and Cleveland, was to say, no, we'll figure out how to do it together, and we'll figure out what's best for the institution. That was a very different kind of conversation than they'd had with directors in the past, and it took a great deal of change within the institution to have that sense of shared responsibility and opportunity at all levels of the organization take root and flourish, and indeed it did. And this in turn, I should add, and I hope you would take special note of this, has been vitally important in the institutions I've worked in for engaging young people and encouraging them to become more fully invested in the life of the museum. And that's something that large organizations, as a rule, typically don't do very well, but I think it's a terribly important thing for you to consider as future leaders and managers. Now, another managerial challenge, but one that has been well worth the effort, is the development in these various institutions of a culture of teamwork around a set of core activities. For example, the development of exhibitions, the presentation and interpretation of collections, and audience development, to cite just 3 examples, that are by definition integrative, and by that I mean that involve virtually every part of the organization, but have traditionally been dealt with as the exclusive domain of one department or another. In the old model, for example, curators would take care of exhibitions. Educators would take care of educational programs. Well, the fact of the matter is that curators have as much a stake in educational programs and the content presented in them as educators do in special exhibitions and the kind of interpretive work we do around those. And we all, in turn, curators, educators, marketers, and many others, have a stake in audience development, in understanding how new audiences can be attracted to the museum, engaging them and bringing them in, and making their experience of the museum a deeply satisfying one. Yet this is not the way things have traditionally occurred in museum. And in fact, reshaping traditional ways of working within museums and encouraging new collaborative relationships may strike some of you as a rather old-fashioned issue, and I'm sure in the Academy it is seen as such. But it is still the order of the day in cultural institutions like the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and it still requires a lot of work. That work may be remedial in large measure, but it can't be avoided, and it can yield enormous dividends for the institution. And finally, I'd like to conclude by mentioning what for me are 2 key leadership issues and ones that I spend a lot of time thinking about. The first, to return to a phrase I used a few minutes ago, is building institutional capacity, and how I think about that as a director. But in this case, I mean building institutional capacity for change. And this has been central to my work as a director, both in the sense of always asking our staff and our trustees to think about first causes, about our mission, about why we do things that are central to the museum and whether those things are still central and relevant to our mission. You'd be surprised, I imagine, I suspect, but perhaps you wouldn't be, that these things are not often attended to in the daily grind of work. They tend to be left to strategic planning and sessions once a year with trustees and the like, but these are questions that need to be asked each and every day, and if they are, they can often yield very, very interesting and very useful insights. But far more frequently, I find myself asking how we can innovate at the margins. That is to say, how we do what we do better, or how we can do what we do better or differently in response to the challenges and opportunities in the environment. And poking and prodding and improving things at the margins is very important work. It requires me to be in touch with every part of the institution, but also has a reciprocal benefit of letting the staff know that I understand their work and what we're doing across the board, and I think that's terribly important. Now, the second leadership issue, if I may call it that, is the aspirational part of my work. And that is how I ask everyone involved with the museum, not only our staff and trustees, but also our donors, our members, and even our visitors, to think about and think with me about the place of the museum in our society and our future. To do so as a director and to do so effectively is very important for me. because it's a way of articulating a vision of the museum that's compelling, that touches individuals, and finally is about the enduring value of the arts to us individually and in the life of our communities. And this, I'm sure you would agree, is work well worth doing, and really a fundamentally important role and responsibility for the director. So I'll stop there and say thank you for being